Ladies and gentlemen, and this is a critique of realism by channel Kraut. Yes, this is one of the latest video, I guess, was uploaded 2 weeks ago. 1.5 hour, damn. So this is going to be one of the philosophical type of videos, I guess, talking about the concept of realism. I don't know much about realism, but as a concept, I think it mostly applies to applying things based on what's real in the world rather than having some kind of a hopeful ideology of things, or seeing things in a different way that it's not real, basically, right? So somebody hoping for achieving something out of certain ideology, like this is how I see my country becoming, or something like that. While realism, I think, is just basically using what you have, what is happening in the world, and achieving goal based on that. Right? Yeah. But yeah, this is going to be a fun video. Kraut is great at the topics like this, ideologies, philosophies here and there. So yeah. Remember, if you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe so I know which type of videos to react to more. Check out the next Sunday, there's a link in the season. And yeah, let's watch it.
This video is a critique of the foreign policy school of realism, which recently got a lot of attention in the news media because of the war in Ukraine. Many prominent realists, such as John Mearsheimer and Henry Kissinger, have been giving talks and writing articles since then advocating for an end of Western support for Ukraine. The injection of political opinions in the news is something we're increasingly aware of, but it can be difficult to navigate, which is why I'm a big fan of Ground News. This website and app gathers related articles from thousands of sources in one place and provides context about the sources. On the homepage, you'll see a wide variety of news stories, but what's unique is every story is accompanied by graphs and analysis to show you the political bias, reliability, and ownership of the sources reporting. There are many news stories on Ground News that are an interesting read as an addendum to this video. For example, if you search for Henry Kissinger on Ground News, you will get a list of all the news outlets reporting on Kissinger's calls for negotiations with Russia from 2 months ago. And then you can go through the tabs left, center, and right to see how outlets of different political bias cover and comment on what Kissinger has recently been saying. Interesting here is that Kissinger recently changed his position and now argues for a NATO membership of Ukraine. And you can now again see how different outlets of different bias report on this change of mind. I have used Ground News for half a year now, and by far...
See, the thing is, this makes me remember, there have been stories, right, where left-wing media titles something about that outcome, while the right-wing titles something completely different, because they see the same thing with two literally opposing views, right? And you think okay, how does that work, right? Result must be one. How is one see other? But that's the point, right? Regardless of what is the result there, you're never going to have complete black and white result of anything, right? So anybody will interpret their way, right? And that has become worse in past 10 years. People say there's more information, that's why we learn it more now. No, not really. Papers have been around for a long time. TVs have been around for a long time. Left and right wing media has been around for a long time. But it's never been this worse. And obviously, if you have some website like this, you can always see what is left saying, what is right saying.
My favorite feature is their Chrome extension, which pops up whenever I'm reading an article to conveniently show me who else is reporting on it and what the bias distribution is. Then I can just click through and read multiple perspectives on the topic in one place. Ground News is especially useful if you follow a lot of political news and if you are interested in how political biases impact reporting on news. But it is also useful if you wish to be aware of your own biases and consider opposing viewpoints with an open mind. If you're someone like that, you are able to use Ground News specifically to seek out reporting and articles that you disagree with, to honestly challenge your own biases and escape a potential information bubble. If you want to sign up for Ground News yourself, go to ground.news/Kraut or use the link in the description. As a frequent user of the platform, I'm confident in recommending it to you and grateful for their continued sponsorship of this channel. Hello, hey. A lot of you liked this video that I made a while ago, and you asked me to make another one like it. There's a video that a lot of you requested for a very long time, critiquing realism, Mearsheimer and Chomsky, and here you go, this is it. But it's a bit of a longer one, so get comfortable. When Russia invaded Ukraine, many people began sharing clips.
Oh yeah, that is right. He has India, Pakistan, India, China, then there's Mexico, US border, but ideology video is only one he made, I think, about the ideology of Russia. Yeah, that was so good video, and I've read to, back enough time that I remember as like, okay, this is Kraut's thing, anything ideology, philosophy type of thing. But obviously he hasn't made that many videos about it. But I guess all videos he makes has some element of it. So this is great. He should tackle more and more topics like this.
Of John Mersheimer, in particular far-left pundits who are critical of an interventionist American foreign policy, which is somewhat funny, but more on that later. Mersheimer argues in these clips that the fault of the war in Ukraine lies with the Americans for creating an existential threat for Russia by advancing the borders of NATO. Mersheimer has also been invited to several discussions after the Russian invasion to speak. Mersheimer is a realist, and it is important to outline here what realism is. I will try to do so objectively, but you are free to point out in the comments if I fail at that. Realism is not an idealistic position or a set of ideological beliefs. Realism is something completely different. Realism is a school of international studies in which people attempt to create a system of analysis that allows for predictive models of analysis of geopolitical developments, despite one's biases. It strives to create an objective framework from which to interpret geopolitics. And although I will argue against this claim to objectivity, I will present realism as faithfully as I can. Realism is a method of seeing and analyzing geopolitics, and not something driven out of any sort of idealism or higher-minded morality. In fact, it is quite the opposite. Realism seeks to ground itself through three guiding principles: that men are self-interested and power-seeking, and therefore that ethics and what ought to be are not good tools to make or predict state policy, and that their natural condition is a state of anarchy. In many ways, shapes and forms, realism has existed for a very long time. In order to
Really? Man's natural state is lawless anarchy. That's one of the part of realism. I didn't know that. Yeah, men are self-interested and seek power. Obviously, that's given. Ideals are counterproductive in geopolitics. That's the main thing I think of when I think of realism. I think if I were to think of a name, I think Bismarck would be that, right? I mean, he manipulated lots of geopolitics around him, manipulated lots of other countries just to achieve that one German state thing. And then Germany formed. He was a big part of that. So I guess he was one of the guys I can think of when I think of realism. Not based on ideology or, some fantasizing about certain thing, but using the real world politics, achieving goal any means necessary, morality and things can, yeah. So I think he's the one when I think of realism. How somebody practice realism.
To justify their starting assumptions, realists often make an appeal to human nature and in particular to history. One such example is Thucydides' famous account of the Peloponnesian War, which Thucydides describes as the confrontation between a honor-bound and, in principle, idealist Sparta with the strongest land army against Athens, the sea power, with a practical and cynical approach to diplomacy and war, who distinctly argue that morality has never triumphed over self-interest and superior strength. Debates over ideas, although fictional, litter the history of the Peloponnesian War, which is why it was not simply interpreted as an account of historical facts, but as the start of a theoretical work. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Melian dialogues, in which Athenians seek to capture the small, inconsequential, independent Spartan colony on the Greek island of Melos. I will leave a link to it in the description, as it is a really good read and helps understand, and I'll do a recording of it with a friend for those of you who are too lazy to read, so you can listen to it. The link will be in the description.
Next summer, Alcibiades. Oh, that's that guy. Isn't it surprising because I've played Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I can remember some names? Alright. Sail to Argos with 20 ships. Okay. I'm going to read that.
With a friend for those of you who are too lazy to read, so you can listen to it. The link will be in the description. The Melians, though militarily weak, do not wish to stray from the ideal that they have the right to be an independent and self-organized polity, and believe that the gods and their allies will come to their aid so that what is right and fair may triumph. The Athenians, on the other hand, seek to convince them to face the facts and surrender rather than face their extinction, and make the point that Athens must conquer them as a show of strength, lest it be thought of as weak. Because the Athenians are animated by the purpose of power, which seems to force their hand just for its own sake. In the end, Melos refuses to surrender, and all men of military age are killed, and the rest sold into slavery in one inconsequential skirmish of the war. I personally like using Machiavelli's The Prince to explain realism, written in a time...
Isn't that surprising? Throughout the years, millennia, right? All these war crimes and shit, it wasn't a war crime at then, right? We won them. I guess all the soldiers are dying now. because we can't risk rebel and revolt and pick any of the any of the things below the list, I guess. So we have to kill. Imagine that scenario, living that time, part of Athens. I'm not even saying part of Spartans colony who's going to die, but part of Athens colony. You just have to just kill people, right? Because you can't do anything else. That's so fucked up, man. But that's how it happened for millennia before people were like, this is war crimes.
When Italy was dominated by city-states ruled by princes who vied for power and dominance over Italy. Machiavelli wrote that a good ruler cannot be driven by ideals, in particular those of the domineering religious morality, but must engage in the struggles of competing Italian city-states through hard-boiled calculations of what benefits the city-state's position. The prince, in order to succeed, has to therefore engage in actions and policies that may be deemed as morally objectionable or even outright evil. But such objections based on ideals and conceptions of morality are a pointless sideshow and distraction from success in the game of power. The means, therefore, justify the ends in a way. But it would also be a grave misconception to present the realist school as one of people endlessly justifying bloodthirsty conquests and conquerors. There are many historical figures and events that realists like to study as a foundation of interpreting modern geopolitics, and that includes most notably peacemaking. One example is the Napoleonic Wars, in which realists disregard Napoleon and instead praise Metternich. Napoleon, from the realist perspective, is someone who destabilized the balance of European powers, where each one could more or less keep the others in check. He did so by driving French territory and sister republic buffer states deep into Italian, Austro-Hungarian and Russian lands, thereby turning them all against France in coalitions that he could not hope to defeat.
Yeah, it makes sense. People like Napoleon, Hitler, these people would not be praised by realists, because it's one thing to achieve a goal, but you also have to see the grand picture of stability. That's also part of realism, because if you make the region so destabilized in your pursuit to dominate the world, that's never going to end well. And yeah, so in that way, I can see how realists would dislike people like Napoleon.
Metternich, however, is often regarded by many realists to be an ideal guideline of how to conduct foreign policy. Through hard-boiled calculations, ruthless power politics, the creation of an intricate network of alliances, taking account for the spheres of influence of others while not losing sight of one's own aspirations, Metternich, the de facto ruler of Imperial Austria, despite his country losing the most battles of the Napoleonic Wars, managed to guide the Austrian Empire to coming out on top at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, gaining new territories, securing and expanding its sphere of influence, and making it one of the most powerful powers in Europe despite its internal problems, and most of all, creating a system of power distribution called the Concert of Europe, where every power was so expertly balanced against each other that there would be no major European war for almost a century. Bismarck is another historian.
Yeah, so Austria at the Napoleonic War, by the at least end of it, he the ruler of Austria, I'm guessing him, I forgot the name, was actually who was the father-in-law of Napoleon, right? Because I'm pretty sure his daughter is the one who married Napoleon. So if anything, you think that when sitting in his chair, really think about it, seeing how Napoleon dominated the world for long time, and now being in the position of actually being a family, you would think that he would side with Napoleon, but he did not. So I guess his vision of Europe was much like realists praise him, was much more in that way than actually back Napoleon. So I guess realists are not that far off when they praise Austria and how they conducted.
Figure that realists have much admiration for. His cold and ruthless application of power politics is famous, playing games of power and influence with Austria, Denmark, France and the German states, carefully playing them out against each other, always careful to not overextend and be in a state in which he would be outnumbered by enemies, and transforming Prussia into a German empire, not for an offensive war of conquest, but rather by defensively unifying them against the French in a union so lasting it became its own state. We can learn more by looking at a historical figure for which realists have a lot of scorn and hold up as the worst type of geopolitical leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Because a core foundation of realism is not just an advocacy of cold, hard-boiled power politics with the intention of becoming the strongest power on earth. There may not be rules to game of power politics, but there are limitations. And these limitations are determined by the other players in the game. And if these players can't become the most powerful players, they will go for the second best thing, their own security and existence. As Hegel said, the state has no higher duty than of maintaining itself. Kaiser Wilhelm disregarded these other players, as well as their aspirations and spheres of influence. He managed to threaten simultaneously the French with the Agadir and Tangier crisis, the British with the building of the High Seas Fleet, and the Russians with the unconditional backing of Austria-Hungary, sacking three great powers against him for the price of a single dysfunctional alliance with Austria that was based more on misguided ideals rather than by geopolitical calculations, and another with the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, see, this is the same thing as Napoleon and Hitler, like I said, that you can have all the ambition, but if you disregard other powers, you're kind of destabilizing, right? I mean, you need to coexist in the end, right? So if you don't see that, like, that is part of realism. Like, you need to understand that, okay, I want to be most powerful, but there are also other players here which are also has to keep happy at a certain level, right? If you're gonna make everybody angry, like, I don't care, but no, I'm the most powerful one here, yeah, that's going to destabilize. Same way how, I mean, Napoleon was a bit too much, but it is kind of in the same region.
Empire. In the end, from the realist perspective, Kaiser Wilhelm, who did not appreciate the limitations that were set by other players in the game of powers, managed to unite all the other power players against him and lost what Bismarck had built. So take note of this, because this is something that many fail to understand about realism. Realism is not an instruction manual on how to gain unlimited power and influence based on an unrestrained application of power in geopolitics. Realism also argues for restraint. Realism argues that powers must appreciate that other powers also play the game of power. Realism argues that one should calculate one's geopolitical decisions of foreign policy in appreciation of those informal limitations set by other powers. To put oneself in their shoes before thinking to act to gain advantage, lest you lock each other in an inefficient and avoidable conflict.
Basically understand the game and the rules. Don't try to be, I'm way too powerful, I'll change the game's rules. That's not going to work.
Part is a weakness of the realist school. My friend Frog did a very good video presenting that weakness, and he helped me somewhat with this video, so I will leave a link to his video in the description here too. For my outline on realism, I'm going to use the author Hans Morgenthau, who is one of the founding thinkers of modern realism as a school of international relations and geopolitics. This is not to say that he is the only one or the most important. There are many other important realist thinkers. Morgenthau just happens to be the one that I read and am more familiar with, specifically his book, Politics Amongst Nations. Like Thucydides and Machiavelli, Morgenthau argued that all international relations is driven by natural laws of struggles for power between states. His theory is not just descriptive, it has predictions. To formulate and implement effective policy, one should not build it upon one's ideals of what one believes is good for society, but study power dynamics, understand the natural laws that govern power struggles between human beings, and formulate one's policy on what would work most effectively in this power struggle. Morgenthau argued that nation-states are the foundation of all international politics, and that national interests were the main motivations behind all foreign policies, that the desire for and pursuit of raw power, at best to secure the existence and continuation of the state, was the reason for and by which nation-states engaged in the world to enlarge or defend their national interests. Power being defined by Morgenthau as the control over the minds and actions of men, in particular political power as the mutual relations of control among the holders of authority and between the latter and the people at large. Because of the fact that nation-states pursue an expansion of their sphere of influence in competition with others, insecurity and the threat of violence is a constant, ever-present state that will never go away. Hence, the full title of Politics Among Nations, the struggle for power and peace. That is because every nation-state is out there to use whatever means it can to expand its national influence. Additionally, being exclusively defensive in one's sphere of influence rather than offensive in growing a sphere of influence does not often work as a means to escape the constant potential for conflict. Because even if every actor was faithfully doing this, any defensive action taken by nation-states could be seen as offensive by its competitors, and therefore produce a counter-defensive action, thereby continuing a cycle of aggression. Realists call this the security dilemma. Morgenthau also argued that national interests are dynamic, meaning they change over time and are influenced by factors such as culture and technology. One has to constantly reevaluate what one's national interests are, for if they change and one doesn't realize this, it is possible to waste enormous resources only to just lose the game of power. Let me give an example. After the end of Mongol rule over China, the Chinese spent almost 600 years fighting and trying to conquer the steppe peoples of Mongolia and Central Asia. It was in their interest at the time. They wished to secure themselves from the invaders of the past, and they wanted to make sure that something like the Mongol conquest of China could never ever happen again. But in doing so for almost 600 years, the Chinese neglected every other geopolitical sphere, such as their eastern neighbors. They neglected their coastlines. They lost spheres of influence over Japan and the rest of Asia. They neglected seafaring. They neglected technological developments in ocean navigation. They neglected new military technologies that were not useful in fighting steppe peoples. They neglected bureaucratic and institutional reforms. They neglected the new economic developments around coastal commerce. And they neglected the resulting cultural and political developments in societies. Consequently, they did not realize the significance of European imperial powers arriving. By the 1780s, the Chinese had successfully conquered and pacified Mongolia, Southeast Siberia, and the eastern parts of Central Asia. But the peoples from these lands who they had conquered and who had, yes, menaced China for almost 2,000 years, had stopped being a threat to China 300 years before. Mongolia was no longer the priority national interest. Instead, the British opium merchants who arrived at the same time along the coast were. China did not realize that its national interests had changed, and consequently, China took a huge loss in the game of power. As this example shows, there is no such thing as a permanent national interest. A nation should not consistently pursue the same.
I'm not sure you could call that national interest change. It's like it added. I mean, they had to unify the China. That was their interest to begin with. And because of the past, they would have had to do that eventually. Otherwise, that would have been always be roaming over their head. But at the same time, they should have also shouldn't have neglected all the things happening around them. Right? They shouldn't have just focused on one thing. So basically, they should have, what other national interest has just, added to my list. They should have checked that rather than just focusing on one thing. I mean, that happens a lot, right? People focus on just one thing. I mean, right now, let's just say oil. Oil is the thing, right? That's the national interest of everybody. And people have big, long-lasting plans for that. But what if some new technology comes, hydrogen cell storage or whatever, something just gets better, right? And the world moves on to something else, but one nation just still has that plan of oil. That's like, that fits this scenario. Like, you need to be, even though you invest everything in this, if the landscape changes, you have to evolve with that. Otherwise, you're just going to be left behind, even with all the effort.
Same goal throughout time, because the environment can substantially change. Therefore, according to Morgenthau, one should continuously study and re-evaluate the national interests of a nation and adapt to changing dynamics of the power game. Morgenthau also argued that any idealism is entirely misplaced, self-limiting and pointless in the study of international politics. Nation-states, groups, communities and societies may develop concepts of morality and ethics, but a universal application of such systems of ethics is not possible because every moral system must be trickled down to the specifics of any given situation. Nations therefore ought to separate their own moral aspirations from ideals of moral universalism, legalism or sentimentality. Values and concepts of ethics should be strived towards discussion of implementation at home, but have no place on the international stage. The inspiration and historic events that led the political scientist Morgenthau to conclude this were the failure of idealistic international organizations and governing bodies such as the League of Nations in preventing the Second World War. In summary, Morgenthau argued that there are ultimately no ideals or rules that govern international politics and relations. Instead, international politics is driven solely by power politics, and the only rules that exist are informal and created not deliberately, but by the restraints of one's power by other powers. Morgenthau believed that international politics is somewhat like a poker game, that this poker game is played by great powers, such as the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. That these great powers have spheres of influence which contain smaller nation-states, and these smaller nation-states are the chips played in the poker game of geopolitics. Therefore, foreign policy should be driven with a disregard of idealism in favor of cold, hard-boiled calculations of how to play this poker game. But here's the catch. The game never stops. From the realist perspective, nobody can ever win this game. The poker game is assumed to be endless. The poker chip.
Basically, there is no one dominating anything. That will never last because everybody will be different. So you are always playing the game in the end. You should always goal for something, not to put anybody in the corner or back against the wall, because that's going to be disastrous. You should always see your limitation of the game based on what others around you. I mean, you can have the most power, but only if the others have just sufficient enough power so they can preserve themselves and not to put their backs against the wall, basically. And if you're like Marxism or something like that, communism, how it rises, you can't see like, I'm going to make the whole world like this. That's never going to work. Same thing with the Nazism, how Hitler saw, like, I'm going to make the superior race or whatever. That's not going to work. So basically, realism is that seeing how the world works right now, using power to gain the upper hand, but you cannot just dominate everything. There has to be some peace and stability at the grand scale.
Chips are constantly exchanged in an endless power struggle. Nobody can ever fully enforce their ideals over others, because this power struggle is shaped by cold national interests in power. Great powers may sometimes lose their great power and thereby lose their spheres of influence to new great powers, but geopolitics will always be dominated by great powers and struggles over their spheres of influence. The potential for violence and escalation, therefore, never stops. The realist also assumes that if all players gang up on one, that one will stand up and draw a gun before losing to everyone. And it is that potential for violent escalation that the realist wants to avoid at all costs, in particular in the post-World War II era of nuclear weapons. Now, let me interrupt here briefly to address something. Many of you will have probably noticed and already pointed out in the comments how similar a lot of this is to the writings of very different thinkers from very different schools, like Habermas, Adorno, Carl Schmitt, Alfred Rosenberg, Julius Evola, Hoppe, or Michel Foucault. The underlying assumption that there are no values, that ideals and ideologies and rules are just lies and excuses, and that all that matters are power dynamics and the game of power. The fact that they all sound so similar is not a coincidence, and neither is it a testimony to the influence of Morgenthau. The reason why they all sound so similar is because of a shared historical experience. It is not a coincidence, but it is also not a conspiracy. They may all sound similar, they may have even partially read each other, but they didn't all conspire somehow to come to and promote similar conclusions. And that is because they all have
It's an observation of the world, seeing how things have played out throughout the millennia, right, all the way to Athens, Greek time, and they can see how realism basically just reflects on how the world is, accept how the world is, never force anybody to the last edge, I guess, and you accept those, basically laws of the game and play the game that way, I guess. That's realism. Of course, there are lots of people who's going to come to this conclusion because that's how it's played out. Anybody who's tried to force a hand or try to dominate in any way has always failed. There has never been a guy who's dominated the world and stayed that way for a long time. They always failed and collapsed into fragmentation.
Origins in the same thing, something called the crisis of modernity. What is the crisis of modernity? In the wake of the Enlightenment, there was a common understanding throughout political schools of thought that humanity could advance and perfect itself through the rational examination of the world it inhabited, bypassing the crude institutions of unjustified tradition and faith that had held society back. There was a frontier to be won, and with it the promise of a perfected civil and moral order for mankind. From that perspective, in 1789, the French Revolution upended 1,000 years of primitive despotism and institutional stagnancy, guided by bold propositions inherited straight from the Enlightenment: universal human rights, freedom, equality and brotherhood, ideals that every contemporary liberal democracy is built upon. A few years into the revolution, Kant published Zum ewigen Frieden, or Toward a Perpetual Peace. a treatise of international relations that is the foundation of a liberal theory of international relations. Concurrently, advances in technology and science enabled the uplifting of standards of living, travel, education, while the abundance of production increasingly melted away the entrenched poverty of the world, together with breakthroughs in medicine and sanitation, such as through the eradication of germs. During this sudden hiccup of years of progress during the 1800s, what had seemed impossible for all of history, the methodical repealing of every horseman of the apocalypse, is made possible through rational examination of the physical world, and it yields many more bounties: knowledge over universal laws, mastery over nature. Hegel, the prime example of this historicism of the 19th century, observed the spreading of the Enlightenment ideas and declared that the realization of human freedom is the ultimate goal of history, and that it will come to be through the creation of the perfect state. When he witnessed Napoleon defeat Prussia at Jena in 1806, he declared that this moment was the end of history. The French had created the political innovation of the nation-state, and all of history as a political development was just a process of achieving what the French had achieved. But that belief in progress through modernity that had so domineered throughout political schools of thought throughout the 1800s was shattered at the beginning of the 20th century. Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, Isonzo, Gallipoli. In the killing fields of the First Global War, where generations experienced mechanized death brought on by technological and scientific development, a war that was promised by those who believed in political progress that it would be the last war, only for their promise to be almost immediately broken by the Second World War, which industrialized the death process and spread it by design to civilian populations.
Damn.
It would be a mistake to assume that faith in modernity, which we understand as rationalist drives, was upended merely by the process of applied sciences. Almost every field is confronted at the same time by limitations of pure rationality. In mathematics, there is the foundations crisis, where formalists stand refusing proofs of the intuitionist camp, on the grounds that they require an infinite number of steps that can therefore not be reproduced formally. Yet this is how we proceed to build real numbers. Gödel throws the whole field into disarray when he theorized that the axioms of mathematics can neither be consistent or able to prove all true theories, sending all mathematicians ever since into an exercise of faith in their axiomatic systems. In physics, the quantum realm fractures the discipline into various schools, the schism being still unresolved, among others the uncertainty principle, that you can neither know accurately the position or the speed and direction of a particle, raises questions about the limits of rational observation and experimentation. In economics and international relations,
Okay, I see. Of course, there's a limit. There's not going to be never a true answer of anything, but it's as a process, that's a good way to implement, right? I mean, all this raises question, like basically the core of it, you can never know 100% sure, and obviously quantum world has shown us that, you can never have one answer all the time, or no certainty can be achieved. I mean, that applies to a lot of things. When you really think about it, there's many things in science when you come to it. At the last point, you can never know anything for 100%. You just come to a point and agree collectively that this is fine enough and you move on. But in the end, as a process, that's still good, right?
Paradoxes of rationality forced the injection of psychology in endeavors of formal rationalism, creating behavioralism where an arithmetic of wealth distribution and peacemaking was anticipated. In 1938, Husserl wrote in The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology of a crisis of European humanities, the disproportionate evolution of the hard sciences compared to the humanities. Though mathematical and physical problems may cast doubt upon the role of rationality as a driver of human progress, the worst development is not that the claim to modernity of the sciences is broken, but that the humanities broke before the sciences did. For example, humanity advanced into the nuclear age without the political tools to make humanity's survival in a nuclear age a certainty. And in our day and age, while having still not solved this conundrum of the nuclear age, a second, that of climate change, piles on as the gap between science and the humanities remains. Ironically, centuries before we faced these conundrums, figures of the Enlightenment itself.
Look, science is progressing the way it is. Right? It is what it is, right? We want different result. That's a different thing. And as far as, we acquired nukes before we could understand like how to survive nukes. I mean, that's the problem with humans from the start, isn't it? I mean, yeah. I think, our expectation of science and how the results should be is kind of like a bit higher. It is what it is. There is no certainty in science 100%, but whatever certainty that we have, or we call it a certainty, is still good enough than the alternative. But damn, this is such a good video, man. I didn't see this coming. This is, seeing how humans have throughout think about, seeing different events, how people come to the different conclusion based on what. This is great, man.
Were already aware of this conundrum and warned of it. As the French Renaissance humanist François Rabelais famously wrote, "Science without conscience is but ruin of the soul." Hegel's vision of a perfect state that would end history died in the early 20th century, in struggles and conflicts perpetuated by those who wished to achieve that end of history. What was left in its ashes was not an idealistic striving for modernity, but best described by Churchill, the worst system of government with the exception of all others. Churchill's rashness towards other forms of government stems from the fact that he spent a great deal of his career fighting them. The main political innovation of the 20th century, and a direct answer to modernity, were the fascist and totalitarian regimes whose main accomplishments were the destruction of idealistic institutions, violent lawless barbarism, and the creation of new crimes, genocide and crimes against humanity. In the Soviet Union, communism, a political force that supposedly would usher in the end of history through a supposedly scientific understanding of humanity and history, ushered in a regime of mass arrests, paranoia, gulags, mass graves, and famines. The fact that these systems, which were always constructed as a rejection of the modern world, not only existed but were able to seriously threaten modernity for the better part of the century was felt as the final traumatic wake-up call from the historicism of modernity for many thinkers, at least those who made it out of the early 20th century alive. Stefan Zweig wrote a very quotable suicide note disguised as a book called The World of Yesterday, in which he reminisces the pre-war world which he adored, from which the fascists...
Yeah, see, science without conscience, that's the problem with our society, isn't it? There is always going to be pros and cons with how we live. The world, largely, today is mostly based on democracy and free world, right? Freedom, that's the main core of things. But freedom also creates uncertainty in many places, especially with people. People unpredictable, right? Global warming clearly told us that we don't give a shit, right? I mean, of course we're trying, but overall we are not going to give up lots of leisures that we have, even though we've been told that this is going to be disastrous just because we can't see it now. That's how short-sighted we are. And because of the freedom, nobody can do shit because it's up to people, isn't it? And science, you can't stop science. Science will happen, if not here, then otherwhere. And science is basically, it's gonna be achieved somewhere. So science is what it is. Science is a tool, but how we use it is up to us, right? And humans can be with no conscience lots of times. So, in a really fucked up and horrible authoritarian world where nobody has freedom, science can be tamed in that way, but that's a horrible way to live. If you want to live in a free world that we live and love living it, there's going to be lots of chaotic uncertainties like that. So, see, the fucked up thing is, what if only way humans can survive is a really fucked up authoritarian world where nobody has freedom, everybody's everybody's rights are taken away, but at the same time, this body can make sure the world lives on, can tame the science. But that's not the way to live, right? And the way we live right now, more of a free world that we live off with our choices. What if this world inevitably ends us with some kind of, nuclear annihilation or whatever, right? So this is like, is there a center thing we can achieve? Or is this something we can, there's always this kind of an issue.
Drove him because of his ethnicity and gives an account of the losing fight that he and his fellow intellectuals fought to prevent its methodical destruction during the world wars. My friend Frog recommended me this book, and I highly recommend that book to you as well. Many political thinkers concluded from the horrors from 1914 to 1945 that modernity and the idea of progress was a lie. Almost all of them concluded that what mattered in the end were just power dynamics. The reason all the thinkers I cited earlier sound so similar is because they all have similar origins in a time period in which the concept of modernity and the concept of idealism was questioned. Fascists saw modernity as a manipulation. The Nazis saw it as a Jewish lie. The Nazis specifically believed that what ultimately mattered was competition for resources between races, and the power dynamics of a race war is all that matters. One of the foundational texts of Nazi political theory is Alfred Rosenberg's The Myth of the 20th Century, in which he outlines a theory of history as mainly driven by racial struggles and competition for resources. The Nazi legal theorist Carl Schmitt declared the liberal state to be too weak for the preservation of a functioning social order, declared that all politics was struggles for power between enemies, that all disagreements were ultimately conflicts between enemies, and that therefore a fascist leader must attain absolute power. Carl Schmitt also applied this line of thought in his writings on geopolitics as driven by nothing but ruthless cold power dynamics in which might makes right. And the fascist political theorist Julius Evola wrote in his Revolt Against the Modern World that tradition was inherently a political force that lacked concepts of political theory and therefore contradicted the idea of progress or modernity, which had to be destroyed. Fascism fundamentally advocates for and is an ideology based upon the destruction of modernity and idealism, in favor of a lawlessness of power dynamics. But they were not the pioneers of the crisis of modernity. A century before the Nazis, Johann Gottlieb Fichte spoke a series of speeches, the Addresses to the German Nation, which was an attack against the ideals that the French occupation had imported to Prussia. Fichte in his speeches outlined a concept of the world as a power struggle among races, and in rejection of any ideals of universalism, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. Adorno, Habermas, and Foucault were leftists disillusioned with Marx, because the material conditions for communism that Marx had predicted never came to be. They therefore abandoned the traditional Marxist historical materialism as a driving mechanism of history. They abandoned the concept of progress as well, and instead analyzed history with a focus on groups who had historically been oppressed, be it colonized peoples, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, or sexual minorities. They concluded that there were no ideals or rules, but merely the power dynamics of oppression and liberation from oppression. Hoppe was a student of Habermas, who merely used the same conclusions to advocate for the abolition of any state concept of rules and ideals in favor of a ruthless, lawless, anarchist capitalism. And finally we get to Morgenthau, who came to his conclusions when faced with the rise of the Nazis and even argued explicitly in 1946 that belief in human reason was deficient because of the rise of Nazi Germany. It would be a mistake, though, to think of Morgenthau as a Machiavellian figure instead of a tragic one. Morgenthau was a German liberal and supporter of the Weimar Republic. He lived through its collapse and the rise of fascism throughout Europe. He despaired at this, fled into exile in the United States, where he was confronted with an American unwillingness to face the outbreak of the Second World War and its consequences, right up until those came knocking at Pearl Harbor. He despaired at what he lived through and concluded that what he had witnessed had happened because liberalism and the liberal state were shackled by its own ideals and put in the same danger that had uprooted his life. Morgenthau therefore believed that liberal democracies of the world cannot engage in a foreign policy that is based on liberal ideas, that the liberal power of this world, the United States, must act ruthlessly and often against its own liberal values on the international stage to preserve itself. Okay. Contrary to his recommendations, though, Morgenthau did stand up to US foreign policy makers in the name of his own morals on more than one occasion. For instance, he was one of the first academics to object to the Vietnam War. In 1966, in The Purpose of Political Science, Morgenthau wrote that the US had overlearned the lessons of realism and lost sight of the appropriate legal and moral limits to the application of power, and was even fired from his post because of his protest. In the early days of the Cold War, he was an opponent to policies of containment that could frivolously make enemies of the USSR. In the first edition of Politics Among Nations,
yeah, I mean, US with Vietnam, I mean, you can interpret that in any way. I mean, I could see from where they are coming from, right? Cold War is weird place, right? It wasn't going all out, but it wasn't nothing as well. It was in the center of it, so you could interpret it in any way you want at that point. So people, even though lots of things were disastrous, you could see someone's point of view, like why were they trying to achieve something? Yeah, there's something. Damn, this was a good video, man. I'm going to do other ones later, I guess, in 3 parts, I guess. Was a half of hour is done, I guess. But yeah, this is really good. I didn't know about realism this much, but yeah, it's deep thoughts go into this one. But yeah, I guess realism is more like a default way of seeing things. It's realistic views, I guess. I don't know. It puts aside all the ideologies and things, hopeful things, fantasizing about something. Now, when I think of realism, the only thing I'll think is realism basically seeing the world how it is, using that to grab the power, because that's only thing is to grab the power, I guess. You can't stagnate, and making sure that you don't try to take all of it, because it's never going to work. Never put somebody's back against the wall. See the limitation of that playing field rules and play it that way, I guess. Bismarck is the great example for that, I guess. But yeah, I'll do the other part tomorrow, I guess. If you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe. If I got something wrong from this video, I mean, this is the first time watching it. First time I'm hearing anything about realism. I just knew it as a top, like what realism is, right? I just read it in 2-liners and, made my assumption based on that. I never read or saw anything on realism. This is the first video. So if I got something wrong, definitely say in the comments, right? And yeah, I'll see you next time.